What's up, everybody? Mr. Forrest back with another episode of E3. Guys, I can't wait. It's so much fun. Let's jump right into it. The Johnsons were making the long and tedious car trip to Grandma Edna's house, and it made it feel even longer because they couldn't ever decide on where they wanted to stop and eat lunch. Mary always wanted Taco Bell, but Ed hated Taco Bell. Ed said,
"It's fake Mexican food."
Ed wanted to eat at KFC because Ed wanted chicken livers, and his favorite way to eat chicken livers was dipped in honey mustard and hot sauce. Mom and Dad wanted to go to Arby's because they wanted to shovel piles of sliced meat into their faces, and back and forth they would argue, and finally they would stop somewhere and somebody would be upset, and every 5 minutes Mary had to go to the bathroom. They'd try to hide the water from her, but she'd always somehow find it. She would guzzle it, and inevitably in 5 minutes she'd say, "We have to stop and find a bathroom right now, otherwise I'm gonna have an accident in the car." It was a long trip. So to pass the time, they would play games like the ABC game. Now the ABC game, you start with the letter A and you look for an object or a word that starts with the letter A and then B and then so on and so forth. They would play the license plate game, and that's where you look for license plates from various states and see how many you can find in a certain time limit. They would play hide the water from Mary, but you know how that went. They would sing songs until they were tired of singing, and then finally everybody would be so tired they'd be quiet for a while and sometimes fall asleep. Now, Mary couldn't read in the car because she would get car sick, but thankfully Ed was able to read in the car. And Ed did what he did every single day of his life. He opened his Bible and he read from the Word. And today he was reading from Ephesians 2. Let's take a look at what Ephesians 2:11 and 12 says. "Therefore remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." Ed was short, and people reminded him all the time because people made fun of him all the time. For example, one day his teacher, Mrs. Couvasier, asked Ed to go to the closet and get the 3-hole punch. And Ed felt honored that she would ask him to get the 3-hole punch. So Ed strutted over to the closet and he opened the giant closet door and he looked around, but he didn't see the 3-hole punch until he looked up to the very top shelf. Now, Ed was way too short to reach the 3-hole punch on the top shelf. He stood on his tippy toes. He reached as high as he could, but he wasn't even close. So he looked around for something to climb or something to stand on, and he found some random kid's geography book, and he plopped that down onto the ground and stood on it. It was nice and thick, and he stood on his tippy toes, and he reached up, and he was still not even close to the 3-hole punch. So Ed looked around for something else, something to stack on top of the book, and he couldn't really find anything, so he grabbed his lunchbox from his cubbyhole, and he put it on top of that random kid's geography book, and he stood on the 2 stack. Even on his tippy toes, even with the geography book and the lunchbox, he was still way too short. So he looked around for something, anything to stack on those 2 things, but he realized that by now Mrs. Couvasier would be wondering what had taken him so long, and Ed didn't want to make the walk of shame back to his seat and be humiliated when Mrs. Couvasier asked someone who was taller to go back and grab the 3-hole punch. And so Ed had a brilliant idea. He opened up his lunchbox. Now, lunch hadn't happened yet, so his lunchbox was filled with goodies. Grapes and Cheetos, a sandwich, his thermos. He grabbed his thermos filled with grape juice and he closed his lunchbox and he put the thermos on top of the stack. So the stack went like this: random kid's geography book, lunchbox, thermos filled with grape juice. Now the thermos wasn't big enough for him to stand on with 2 feet, so he balanced on 1 foot and he stood on his tippy toes and he reached as high as he could. And his fingers were just barely brushing up against the 3-hole punch. He was almost there. He just needed one more thing to put on that stack and that 3-hole punch would be his. Ed, his eyes were darting back and forth. His mind was racing. His head was on a swivel, trying to think of something. And then he remembered the Tupperware container that hosted his favorite sandwich. He opened up his lunchbox and he pulled out that container, closed his lunchbox, put the thermos back on top, blew a kiss to his favorite sandwich in the world. By the way, his favorite sandwich was a peanut butter, onion, and ice cream sandwich. Now, most kids eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and they call them PB&Js. Ed would eat a peanut butter, onion, and ice cream sandwich and he called it a P-boy. Ed blew a kiss to his P-boy and put it on top of the stack, which looked like this. Random Kids Geography book, lunchbox, thermos filled with grape juice, Tupperware container with a P-boy sandwich. Ed stood on his tippy toes on one foot, balancing, reaching up as high as he could, and then he got it. He got the 3-hole punch and Ed was so proud of himself he started doing the Ed dance, but as he was shifting his weight back and forth doing the Ed dance, the tower that he had made toppled and Ed fell in what felt like
slow motion.
The rest of the items in that stack went flipping and flying through the air. The lunchbox hit first and Ed landed on the lunchbox, completely obliterating his lunchbox and his lunch inside. The grapes were squished. He landed hard on the bag of Cheetos, which exploded orange cheese flavored tiger toes dust everywhere in a 5-foot radius. The thermos was flipping and landed top down and shattered the lid and sent grape juice spurting and squirting everywhere. Ed landed on his P-boy sandwich, squirting peanut butter, onion, and ice cream everywhere. The carpet around the closet was ruined. Ed's pants were ruined. His shirt was ruined. His lunch was decimated. This Random Kids Geography book was ruined. But at least he had the 3-hole punch. The 3-hole punch! Ed looked everywhere and he didn't see it until he looked up. And there, on the top shelf, in the exact same place it was before, lay the 3-hole punch. You see, as Ed was falling, it slipped out of his hands as he was flailing and landed in the same spot on the same shelf that it was before he started this whole escapade. The kids were all laughing at this purple and orange kid who smelled really badly, and Mrs. Couvasier's face was turning red, and Ed wasn't sure if it was turning red because she was embarrassed or because she was angry. Ed was short. He was too short to get the 3-hole punch from the closet. He was too short to make the basketball team. He was too short to use the vacuum cleaner without looking really awkward. He was too short to ride the roller coasters at Funland, and all the kids knew it, and the kids made fun of him for it. They made fun of Ed because he was short, but they also made fun of Ed because he was autistic. Now, autism isn't bad, it's just different. Ed felt the need to touch and feel everything. He wanted to run his fingers through everyone's hair. Ed wanted to know what color everyone's socks were, so he would run around and pull up people's pant legs and stare at their socks. Ed wanted routine. He wanted the same thing every single day. That's why he wanted a P-boy sandwich in his lunch for every lunch for the rest of his life. And one day, his mom was packing his lunch and she realized they were out of ice cream. And she wasn't about to tell Ed that she made a P-boy sandwich without ice cream. Because if she had told Ed, Ed would have screamed at the top of his lungs, "The world is coming to an end!" And he would have ran around the house causing complete and total havoc. So she just packed him a regular peanut butter and onion sandwich, hoping he wouldn't even notice that there wasn't ice cream in it. But this was Ed Johnson. Of course he noticed. That day at lunch, he sat down at the lunch table and he opened up his lunchbox, and right away, not just by the sight, even by the smell, he could tell there was no ice cream on that sandwich. Ed jumped to his feet and yelled,
"Oh, the humanity!"
He then ran laps around the lunchroom yelling,
"Soylent Green is made of people.
He dropped down to his knees.
It's people."
Meanwhile, everyone in the lunchroom was like, Ed was autistic, so he was different. And instead of embracing him because he was different, people made fun of him because he was different. But that's how a lot of people operate. They judge people based on what they see about that person. They make judgments on a person if they're a boy or a girl. They make judgments on a person because of the color of their skin. They judge someone because they're short or tall, pretty or ugly, fat or skinny. They judge someone if they're normal or not. And things weren't that different in Jesus' time. You see, the Jews were God's chosen people. God made his special covenant with the Jews. And because of that, they were very proud of that. I mean, God didn't make his covenant with any other nation, and they looked down on other people who were not Jews. Now, people who were not Jews were called Gentiles. And Gentiles had different customs, and they spoke different languages, and they ate different foods. But in a Jew's mind, worst of all, the Gentiles were not circumcised. See, circumcision was a sign of God's covenant with Abraham. It was a special marking on the body that Gentiles did not have. And because they did not have this special marking, the Jews looked down on him like they were gross and disgusting, and they called Gentiles dogs, and they didn't want Gentiles anywhere near them. Now, on occasion, when a Gentile would want to worship the one true God, they'd let that Gentile in and call that Gentile a God-fearer, but that Gentile still did not enjoy all the full privileges and the rights of being a Jew. Ed looked up from his Bible and said,
That's wrong. That's snobby. That's a prejudiced attitude.
As Ed looked up, he noticed that it had started raining, but not just raining, like storming, like thunder and lightning and sheets of rain. And Dad had to slow way down in the car because visibility was low. And Mom and Mary had to stop playing the ABC game because there was really nothing they could see to play the game with. Ed went right back down to his Bible, and he flipped his Bible to the back where they had the maps and the charts, and he found a diagram of the temple in Jesus' time. It was huge, and the temple compound sat on 40 acres of land, and around this compound there were rows of giant pillars that were 37 feet tall, and there were several courts: the court of women, the court of Gentiles, the inner courts, and around the inner courts there was a 4.5-foot tall wall called the Soreg. Now, the purpose of the Soreg was to keep Gentiles out of the inner courts. The Jews took this so seriously that they were willing to arrest or kill any Gentile who would cross this boundary. There were 13 warning signs posted at various places around the Soreg saying, if you cross this line, you have no one to blame but yourself for your death. They were willing to kill somebody who crossed this line. That's probably the reason that Paul was under house arrest in Rome as he was writing this letter to the saints at Ephesus, because he was accused of bringing a Gentile in past the Soreg. Now, in Solomon's temple, the original temple, there weren't all of these boundaries. There weren't all these divisions. The only division was between priest and non-priest. But in Herod's temple, the temple in Jesus' time, there were all kinds of division. There was division to keep women out in a certain area and Gentiles out in a certain area, and Jews were welcome into the inner courts. Now, you have to remember that the temple is where God showed his presence to people. It's where he would allow people to be near to him. So by having the Soreg and by having these divisions, they were keeping women from closeness to God. They were keeping Gentiles from closeness to God. And Ed was hot. It was like there was steam coming out of his ears. Ed could not believe that they would be so snobby, so prejudiced to assume that men were allowed to be closer to God than women, that Jews were allowed to be closer to God than Gentiles. Ed said,
Why do people act this way?
People made fun of Ed because he was short, because he was autistic. People made fun of Sheila because her skin was darker. People made fun of Mike and they called him fat. People would make fun of anyone who didn't have a high IQ or who wasn't good at sports, or who didn't look like a model. People were judging based on the outside, and it was wrong. And Ed was fuming. But just then, Ed heard the screech of tires. He looked up from his Bible and he noticed the car was swerving back and forth. It looked like Dad was losing control. Soon the car was in an all-out spin. They were hydroplaning. That means they were skidding across the water. Ed's dad screamed. Ed's dad yelled, "Hang on!" Ed's mom screamed. Mary leapt over to Ed and grabbed onto his arm, and then the car hit something. But what did the car hit? Are the Johnsons going to be okay? You're going to have to wait till next time. Guys, you need to know that God does not pass judgment on us based on whether we're boys or girls, based on the color of our skin, based on our nationality, based on what we look like on the outside. Guys, that is not how God operates, and that's not how we operate either. And Jesus did something about it. But we'll have to wait till next week to find out what that is. And we'll find out the exciting conclusion to the Ed story. I am super pumped. In the meantime, let's work on our take-home papers, which look like this. Our memory verse this week is Ephesians 2:12. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Don't forget to do your touch and say. Every day, touch each word of your verse and say it out loud. Every day, don't forget to do your Bible reading. Read one chapter in the book of Ephesians till you make it through the book this week. When you guys finish your take-home papers, make sure you have your parents email me to let me know that you finished all your work. The link to the take-home paper is in the description below. My email address is down in the description below. Guys, I can't wait to find out what happens, but we're gonna have to. I'll see you next time. Until then, Mr. Forrest, out.